get you out in time for that.
Doesn't say Willoughby.
It doesn't say.
Doesn't say Willoughby, but you can shoot it.
For this program, it should.
Right.
Is that Dave Willoughby?
Yes.
Hey, Dave.
Long time no see.
I know, it has been. I've never seen you.
And you know, if I had my way, you wouldn't be seeing me in a time today either. But custom dictates.
We used to work on a Brenner,
Is that right?
years and years ago.
Yeah, selling tickets to the raceway.
Those are good old days. Okay. The only way to get done is to get started, right? What were you going to say?
You can't finish if you don't get started.
Before I might need it. This will be a lot calmer than what I've been dealing with lately. Okay.
Chair, you do have a quorum today.
Okay. Well, but I don't have a agenda in front of me.
How you doing?
Thank you, sir. You're a gentleman. Okay. We'll call to order the special meeting of the Fort Ord Reuse Authority for September 24th, 2018. We'll have a pledge of allegiance if Director Alejo would lead, please.
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right. Mr. Hulemart, are there any acknowledgments, announcements, or correspondence?
Just one, Chair, and that is a reminder to the board members that this is a unique month and that we are having our board meeting on the fourth Friday of the month. And so this is one of those few occasions where in the same week we get to see the board members. And you noticed all the staff members on the side are very happy about that. They're all smiling and enjoying the idea of two board meetings in the same week. But yes, Friday, 2 p.m.
Hoorah!
That guy over there is crazy. Okay, so we're a little bit less formal today. It's a workshop, so we'll go ahead and get started. Mr. Hulemart, what's on tap?
Yes, Chair. Today we have a presentation that will predominantly be conducted by Jonathan Brinkman. He might get a little help from staff pulling all this together. I wanted to start the conversation about the Habitat Conservation Plan with some discussion about the context and the history, kind of how we got here. We have several board members. I know Councilmember Smith, Councilwoman Ramers from Carmel were not involved in the early 90s when the conservation program and the Habitat Conservation Plan was underway. We're fortunate to have with us today Bill Collins from the United States Army, who has been involved pretty much from the beginning in habitat planning and conservation on the base. So we wanted to talk a bit about the history because the history brings us to a point in time today where the board is faced with decisions about transition of FORA in June 30, 2020, and Habitat Conservation Plan, the base-wide approach, is under question whether we can get something adopted and in place, including a joint powers authority and the financing mechanisms by that time. And so the board has requested this workshop as a way of providing that kind of background information for a decision to be made by the board. Not today, but we're hopeful. We've set 3 hours aside. We're hopeful that this 40 to 45 minutes of presentation will give rise to a half hour to 45 minutes at least of questions and exchange. And Chair, I appreciate your comment that this is more informal. Staff was hoping that this would be sort of conversational about habitat conservation planning. So beginning with context and history, we have a great presentation that we're going to have today. Where is Justine? I know she's in the room. Justine, would you please stand? This is our intern from California State University, Monterey Bay. Justine, a few weeks ago, was asked by the executive officer if she could put together a timeline that would talk about all the habitat conservation planning that we did on the base. One, this was somewhat educational for Justine, but also as a fresh face looking at this for the first time, I thought it would be a great way to craft a document, craft a timeline that the board members could use in the future for understanding this. So Justine's done a great job in pulling that together. Of course, Mary and Jonathan were right on her shoulder making sure she got all the right documents to make it work. So I want to thank Justine for all her work in pulling this together. The second thing I want to mention about this timeline, there are a couple of people in the room, Nancy Amadeo for sure, Ralph Rubio pretty much closely. I think I'm, along with Stan Cook and Bill Collins, were pretty much lived everything you're seeing on this timeline. So we're going to go through it in a little bit. Bill is going to correct me every time I mention the federal work and make sure I've got it right. Stan's going to step on my foot every time I mention the extra work that ESCA has done to make this Habitat Conservation Plan work. So first, we know about 1991 with the announcement of closure. We know that right after that there was a lot of gnashing of teeth and there were a lot of closing apartments. There were businesses that went down. A lot of the community was very concerned. But one of the major things that the leadership in this region said was preserving the habitat was a crucial part of any recovery plan. The community-wide task force that pulled together the base reuse plan, the Fort Ord reuse group that started the planning, all felt it was crucially important that habitat be protected because about 2/3 of the base or so was some of the best habitat you would find on the Central Coast for certain species. And I'll let Jonathan talk about what those species are later. I will note, however, that the University of California, and I noticed that Steve Matarazzo's here, got very much involved right from the beginning because for black legless lizards, Aniella that is, this was some of the best habitat in the whole nation for that particular species, listed species. So in 1993, we got involved in the base-wide disposition, the Environmental Protection Act, as well as ESA, Endangered Species Act, required a habitat mitigation program as mitigation for what was going to be a disposal of former Fort Ord property at that time, not a reuse, but a disposal process. And in that disposal process, they also pulled together biological opinions under Section 7 of ESA, and there was an issuance of a biological opinion later in '93 that sort of dictated the future of how habitat was planned on Fort Ord, including that biological opinion sort of was made reference to and then became the basis for a habitat management plan, that the initial one adopted in 1994. In 1996, there were some rules that were produced by the Department of the Interior that changed certain listings and altered how that would work, and that informed some revisions that had to be done in the habitat management plan. If we can go to the next slide, Jonathan. Those revisions became the form of a new habitat management plan, which initially was coupled with a habitat conservation plan element, and the two were originally presented for adoption to the United States Fish and Wildlife Service in 1997. However, those two documents were going to take quite a while to review. The underlying estimates were that it might take 6 to 9 months to a year to review those two together before a permit could be issued. And a former mayor of the city of Marina, and was the base commander at the Presidio Monterey commander at the time, recommended that those two documents be bifurcated and that they go separately in order that the Army could get the biological opinion approved and the habitat management plan approved. That put FORA in the position of then pulling together a new habitat conservation plan and resubmitting that. That was the beginning of the 20-year process that we are now trying to finish. And so in 1999 and 2000, there was a new biological opinion that was produced. There was that sort of established a significant delay because the new biological opinion and the burn regimen were kind of tied. How was this burn regimen going to work with the Section 7 biological opinion? How were those pieces going to fit? it really meant our habitat conservation plan didn't have the ability to rely on federal property or those areas that were under burn for restoration purposes. And so we had a delay of about 4 or 5 years, starting right around 1999. There was, in the interim period, it says up there 2002, we've often heard of folks refer to the SWAP agreement. That was a county, Monterey Peninsula College, Fort Ord Reuse Authority, and Army agreement to exchange uses on the base that would move habitat from development areas became habitat, some habitat areas became development, to enable the East Garrison project predominantly to occur, and also to enable Monterey Peninsula College to have the parcels they needed for the Public Safety Officer Training Program, the POST program on the former Fort Ord. Then in 2005, FORA and the University of California entered into a natural reserve agreement. During our processing, at that time, we were working with Zander Associates and several other biological experts, by the way, including the current mayor of the city of Marina, who was very much involved in all wildlife biology on the former Fort Ord. And it turned out that the key areas that the University of California would have in its Fort Ord Natural Reserve, FONR, which is out near the airport, were crucial areas for the conservation of certain species which needed to be preserved under any base-wide effort, but certainly for the airport and other areas to be able to go forward and develop their properties. We made an agreement with UCSC and provide dollars for UCSC ever since 2005, plus or minus, for the work that they do on that section of the former base. We then took the bifurcated, Habitat Conservation Plan wound up being bifurcated at that point in 2005. That was to account for the differences between the state of California Department of Fish and Game at the time and their requirements, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the federal Department of the Interior, and the different species, the different listings of species. Sometimes we say endangered, sometimes we say listed. The truth is, listed is the right term. So the differences put us in a situation where we needed 2 different documents, and we were going to create the HCP as the controlling document. Once approved, that would become the basis for a state request for a permit. So HCP under Section 10, and then 2085 permit in the state. Jonathan shaking his head up and down. I've got that part right. Next slide. So since 2005, we have been working feverishly to get the base document, a base-wide habitat program, habitat conservation plan, as the base document for moving ahead with permits. We had several key things that happened in that time period. The East Garrison and Delray Oaks developers each entered a memorandum of agreement regarding California tiger salamander. We had a draft HCP that was submitted. There were special fiscal assurances that were included in at that time. We then had the Department of Fish and Game recommending changing our consultant. They asked us to move forward with a different consultant, so we revamped our program, reissued according to Fish and Game. We had, in fact, I think that was early on, Chair Rubio began heavily getting involved with the state Fish and Game. We hired ICF. At the time they were called Jones and Stokes. That was the name of the company at the time. ICF purchased them later. So we just left ICF on here. They finished our initial draft in 2009. We got comments back and forth from all the forum members and others in 2010. We submitted that. Toward the end of 2012, we had, almost after 19 months of review, we had several legal issues that were still outstanding that set us back, in part because this has now taken so long. We've had 3 different changes at Fish and Game and 3 different changes at Fish and Wildlife Service of the staff reviewing, and changes in the attorney's office. And John, you wouldn't know about attorneys changing their agreements, would you? No. Okay. But we did have attorneys changing enough of their agreements in the past that we now had to revamp the program again. Next. So this is my last slide, so you can all breathe very wonderfully now. Jonathan will take over in a minute. But in 2014, we requested that all the document reviews, we made some adjustments to account for those 2012 changes. We adopted and put together a screen check draft. We distributed it to everyone. We now had California Department of Fish and Wildlife, new name. Not only the people changing, the names are changing. And in addition, we wound up sending to U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service a document that we thought was ready for approval. We did get some guidance back for a public review draft. We were ready to make that happen in early 2016. When we finally got that to the solicitor's office, we got 9 general comments back from Department of Fish and Wildlife Service. Some of those were so stringent that I don't know, Jonathan, I'm not sure how to put this. They were completely distinct from all past comments we had received. In fact, some of those that we received caused us to go to Congressman Farr's office. Congressman Farr was completely angered at the distinct differences that we got from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and I see Bill Collins looking at me. The problem was the department indicated after 19 years of review that we could no longer use the Fort Ord National Monument as part of our habitat conservation plan. And we brought that back to the Fora Board. The Fora Board agreed on submitting a letter questioning those decisions and nearly taking a complete turn at that point and going individually and forgetting the base-wide concept. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service did do a 60-day review of that. They provided a significant number of comments. They agreed to allow for the National Monument to continue to be a part of the overall program. I see Eric Morgan over there shaking his head up and down. Maybe we should have gone like this, but we did do this. And so we put together a base-wide habitat conservation plan. We worked feverishly through 2017 and 2018 and now have all documents reviewed, all comments are in, all documents have been absorbed. Aaron Harwain, are they all in the final version? And the documents are with the solicitor's office. So what you have before you today, that history brings you all the way to today, where just a few weeks ago we have submitted a base-wide habitat conservation plan with the comments from everybody locally, everybody from the state, everybody from the feds, with the exception of the attorneys. And John Giffen and David Willoughby are going to guarantee that we'll get those out real quickly from. So that's the status of where we are today. So just a couple of quick notes. One, in all of this today, please understand there is a very big difference between open space and habitat. Together, between open space and habitat, probably something akin to 76 or 77% of the former Fort Ord is going to be in perpetuity open space or habitat. We're talking about parks, we're talking about California State Park, we're talking about the individual community parks, we're talking about the Fort Ord National Monument, we have the borderland areas to the development that require 200-foot setback from habitat that'll all be open space and managed as though it was habitat. And significant habitat in the county of Monterey, as well as the Frog Pond over there in great city of Delray Oaks. We have a number of areas that comprise the open space and habitat of the base. If managed collectively and continue to be a part of this region's work, it's not just that, it is also an asset to the other work we're doing in the region, because much of that requires respect for the natural environment. It's an asset to housing that'll be in the area because it's an attraction. It does help with tourism, again, as an attraction. So this asset is important. It's not just critical for the protection of listed species, but important for the base reuse plan in general. There's a lot of work that we've done over the years for managing this habitat. It is not inexpensive. There's another second item I want to make sure that's clear. Whether you manage it individually or collectively, it will be very expensive. Collectively, we think it's might be $60 million, of which we've collected approaching 20. There's still more to be collected in order to make that work. So it's an expensive process. It is also one that requires focused attention, because many have assumed, and I've heard this over the course of the last several months several times, that if you don't do anything and leave it alone, it's okay. That's not what we're required to do under the Section 7 biological opinion, or under Section 10, or under the Habitat Management Plan. We're required to manage the properties. So you can't just leave it alone and let it go, because that's not what's required. If you accept the property, you've got to manage it. And the last thing that I really want to mention is there is a significant distinction between what the Federal Endangered Species Act and the state's Endangered Species Act requires, as it pertains to California tiger salamander and certain other flora and fauna. And Jonathan will talk about that later. So this is not simple, but it's also not brain surgery. It can be understood in a 2-hour time frame if we stay focused. And so, Jonathan, if you're ready, that's the end of my comments. I might make another note later on the excellent work that Stan has done with respect to the Environmental Services Cooperative Agreement. Part of our experience has been because we've actually managed this habitat through the ESCA project. It has not been cheap. We've had to keep biologists on staff full-time during the process. But if you have any questions about ESCA, we have plenty of that we can give you as well later.
Okay, before we go to Jonathan, are there any questions for Michael on what he's presented? Yes, Frank.
If I may, just briefly, could you take a moment and explain the difference between the Habitat Conservation Plan and the Habitat Maintenance Plan?
Yes, the Habitat Management Plan, which was adopted in 1997, is a federal document. That federal document describes what has to be completed for each of these individual parcels. There it is typically recorded. With each, I'm getting too much feedback. Oh, okay. The Habitat Management Plan requires management of property, and it requires protection of those listed species. It's under a federal process. It has federal protection. As I mentioned with the ESCA, we essentially manage all of our ESCA properties under the Section 7 biological opinion and in accord with the Habitat Management Plan, because that's required. All of our work under the ESCA is for the Army and protected by the federal governing documents. Habitat Conservation Plan is essentially a document that implements how you would do habitat management planning. I've tried to say it that simply. Jonathan has often agreed with me. He can give you more detail. So think of it as a general plan versus a zoning plan. It's kind of, okay? All right.
Okay, Chair Rubio, members of the board, today I'll be covering these main points, an HCP update telling you about where we are with some additional background, and then summarizing the HCP and the HMP, looking at what their obligations are, what the benefits are from each of those. Then talk about the HCP in the transition plan, and then the JPA formation, and then turn it back to the board on a few recommendations. Alright, so I'm going to start off and just make a kind of wild comparison of a Hollywood franchise, Jurassic Park, Jurassic World, to the Habitat Conservation Plan. I'll say something about the plot, so just a spoiler alert, but I just want to say you can't really compare the megafauna like the sauropods, the hadrosaurs, the T-Rexes, to the salamanders, to the red-legged frogs, the western snowy plover we have in HCP. But you can make some similarities about the plot. In each of those movies, or most of those movies, the Army comes in and bombs the island of the dinosaurs. Sorry to ruin that, but here we had this habitat on Fort Ord, and the Army did a lot of training out here. There was artillery training, grenade ranges, driving over rugged terrain, foxholes, and in those movies, the dinosaurs always survive. They come back in another 2 or 3 years for another movie. Well, the animals are still here on Fort Ord. They've survived this time. They're very resilient. However, they're just not pervasive. So some of these species, 2/3 of their range or 1/3 of their range might be on Fort Ord. And some species, at least an orchid, is only found in Monterey County. So just talking about how do these species get to be threatened or endangered and listed in the federal or state acts, it's because of just this unique habitat we have in California. And they were resilient on the base. So even though the training took place, they're still alive today and thriving on the base. In terms of comparing once more the HCP and the HMP, so the Habitat Management Plan, the version that we are having to adhere to is from 1997. It's an agreement between the Army and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and it allowed transfer of property and also allowed the Army to do its cleanup. So part of the cleanup happens in areas of unexploded ordnance, to really, in some of the heavily contaminated areas, there's got to be sifting of soil. So there's effects to the species. In terms of what the HMP did, it established the reserve system. So in terms of if the HCP is a marathon, this is a half marathon. This HMP got us halfway there, got us part of the way there in terms of setting up a reserve system. That's usually the most expensive part of an HCP, is having the land that is set aside as mitigation. And then it authorized take, but only for the cleanup. And the signatories in the HMP, they agreed to fulfill habitat management in the reserves and in the borderlands. And then what does it, just to compare the HCP, it has the funding to manage the reserve system. It meets the jurisdiction's HMP responsibilities. It would give us federal and state permits. And then also it would form a new joint powers authority to manage the annual expenditures and ensure HCP compliance. Okay, so this is just a quick listing of who are signatories to the 1997 HMP and who are proposed signatories to the 2019 HCP. You'll see here in italics just the California Department of Transportation. They would not be a signatory on the HCP. We've asked if they wanted to participate in the past, and they did not wish to participate. And then those in bold on the bottom list of the HCP participants, those are entities that were not signatories to the HMP, and primarily because there were no habitat reserves that within their property. Okay, just want to summarize the 2016-2017 events. I know we heard from Executive Officer Hulamard, but this is just digging down to a little more detail, finer detail here. So in terms of the letter we received from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service back in July 2016, they gave us 9 general comments for changes to our HCP, our draft HCP. We updated the HCP, prepared a second screen check draft HCP to address these comments. It updated the take analysis for the federal permit. Basically, the main comment to address was that we could no longer rely on the Fort Ord National Monument as mitigation for our federal permit. So we had to look at, okay, what is the take on the non-federal areas on the base? We looked at, we limited the species to the currently threatened and endangered species. So previously we had mirrored the HMP, which included listed species and species with special status or special concern. So we limited to the 8 listed species. We also added mitigation measures on the Fort Ord National Monument because we could get credit as long as we did something in addition to what BLM was already doing as part of their normal management of their property. And so in terms of the timeline, we requested permittees to provide us comments on the second screen check draft. We asked them to turn that around by September 2017. And then on the EIS, EIR, turn that around by January 2018. So then in terms of what actually happened, it took CDFW 11 months to provide their comments. That was the major component that held us back, delayed our schedule. Others submitted on time. The few comments we received only a few comments on the EIS, EIR, and we did not receive any from California Department of Fish and Wildlife. And then in terms of the California Department of Fish and Wildlife comments, they had three main areas of concern: BLM assurances, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service approach to the California tiger salamander management, and then the incidental take permit for Sangilia. So in terms of the BLM assurances, that issue, we don't have it completely settled at this moment. Since it's between those two agencies, there would have to be some kind of agreement or some understanding between the two. It'll likely be part of the state permit conditions that are imposed upon us from the state, but it doesn't stop us from proceeding with our HCP and getting out to public review. So that's the main part of CDFW's comments. On the other issues, we were able to come together and work those out. So with CTS approach, we tailored the state requirements in developing projects within proximity to the salamander's aquatic breeding habitat. We worked on a California tiger salamander hybrid approach. So in terms of the California tiger salamander, there's a non-native salamander that's in the on Fort Ord. It's less prevalent than we had originally thought based on recent testing, but it is an issue of it can breed with the native salamander, and in terms of how to manage the ponds, there's slightly a different approach from the state versus the federal government. The state saw even hybrids as being heavily hybridized salamanders as being the listed species. The federal government was a little more progressive and thought, well, we can manage the ponds and remove some of these hybrid CTSs out of the ponds, and that'll improve the overall native population. But we came to an agreement on some approaches to managing that salamander. And then in terms of the Sangilia approach, there was a concern from the state about the Marina Heights, now it's called Sea Haven developer, received a permit for take of Sangilia a number of years back, and however they did not fulfill their mitigations under that permit, so the state was telling us that the whole species would be under jeopardy. And then we looked really hard at the numbers, and it was a very small percentage affected by the development, and the state agreed to set that aside. In terms of the Sea Haven developer, they would be seeking their own permit if they need to proceed with their development, and our HCP would not be held back or delayed because of that issue. So that was a series of phone calls. Michael participated in each and every one of them, and we were able to come to an agreement on some of those issues with the state. Okay, so in terms of the new schedule, we have it attached to this board report, and I'm going to cover it in just a little bit, some highlights from the schedule. But I want to give this little piece of good news. Behind the cloud, we have the sun. So here we have an order. The Department of Interior had a secretary order on the National Environmental Policy Act. So in terms of how the department would be directed to handle existing environmental impact statements, EISs, they issued a memo on April 27th of this year. They imposed a one-year limit for any EIS that had been in existence prior to that date. They said you're going to complete that by April 2019, and you're going to shrink the document size. We're going to set page limits. So they set the page limit to 150 pages, 300 pages for complicated documents. I think we fall under the complicated document category. So we do need to reduce our page numbers in our EIS, which our consultant's been working on. But the good news was U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is working with us on that contracted timeline. So in terms of where we're at today, we have the final screen check draft review. It's with the solicitor, so they've seen everybody's comments. They're starting to review those documents. They'll turn it around to us with any additional comments. We'll address those and prepare a public draft. So we're looking at a public draft around November, December. It'll be a 45-day review period. And then the HCP JPA formation and the ROD would go after that public review period. but it would all have to be done by April 2019. And the Secretary order didn't really describe what the penalties were if they didn't meet the deadline, but in terms of the federal staff, they don't want to find out what those penalties are, so we're just moving ahead to meet that schedule. And in terms of the state and federal permits, we're expecting those to be issued in May 2019. So I'm going to compare a little more the Habitat Management Plan with HCP and just go piece by piece here. So the first point of analysis, just want to describe here that both require resource management plans for the habitat reserves. The level of detail is generally speaking higher with HCP in terms of management and monitoring of the species. So in terms of the protection in place for the lands, the HMP protects the lands through deed restrictions on the reserves, and the HCP would protect with those same deed restrictions that are included in the property transfer documents and the deeds, but also add conservation easements to preserve, protect, and mitigate the impacts to the species. Just the conservation easements, just a slightly higher standard of if conditions aren't met, someone can step in and require protection of the lands. And that someone would likely be the cooperative, so the JPA that's set up to preserve the habitat. In terms of monitoring, the HMP has fewer specifications and also fewer restoration targets. The HCP has very specific restoration targets and very species-specific monitoring. In terms of borderlands, the HMP requires borderland conditions to be enforced on development along the Fort Ord National Monument. The HCP requires that same requirement. In addition, it requires borderlands conditions around each of the habitat reserves or habitat management areas, HMAs. And then in terms of habitat owners, there's not identified funding sources necessarily for each of the habitat owners and the HMP. Generally speaking, if it's a jurisdiction, they figure out with their general fund or their funding how they would fund the HMP management requirements. Under the HCP, we have the FORA CFD as an identified funding source, and after FORA, it would be the replacement CFD mechanism that jurisdictions set up. Okay, looking at benefits. So the HMP has habitat reserves, have the deed restrictions, allowing the Army to transfer the lands, and also allowing them to complete their cleanup. The benefits for the HCP, the reserves have the conservation easements, but that allows for mitigations of the species and allows for permits. So to manage the development lands and the habitat lands, take would be required, so we get the permits that you need to do that. The benefits for the HMP, there's fewer specifications for habitat management. That can be a good thing if you're a manager and it's less onerous than something that's very specific that you have to meet many requirements for. Under the HCP, we have very specific monitoring requirements and reporting requirements. That's also used to improve the management within the habitat reserves. So using the data to maybe adapt your management of the reserve. So under another benefit for the HMP is the habitat management funding is subject to landowners' budget priorities. So that could be a benefit. In terms of HCP, we have a strategically collected fee through the FORA CFD or its replacement. And then finally, the HMP, there's no reserve requirements in development lands except where there's borderlands that abut the Fort Ord National Monument. But some of the management requirements may require incidental take permits to manage within the HMP. In terms of designated development lands in the HCP, the benefit is that you have permits to allow that development to occur and to manage the borderlands. Okay, I'm going to go a little more specific, looking at jurisdiction by jurisdiction and comparing the HMP and HCP requirements. So first here, the first column we have are the jurisdiction or the agency. The second column, we're showing the estimate of the remaining Fort Ord development lands. on each of these jurisdictions. And then we're looking at, on the third column, the acreages excluding development that is allowed in some habitat reserves. So we're looking at each of the jurisdictions and just in some detail here. And I wanted to point out just a few footnotes here. So the first asterisk is with the Monterey Peninsula Regional Park District. That's within the jurisdiction of Delray Oaks, but it's owned by the park district, not by the city. And then also under Seaside, the 17 acres there, that's a reserve, but it's owned by NPC. And then the double asterisk is a rough estimate of Fort Ord development lands in Marina. So we're just estimating what's left and not entitled in Marina. And then finally the cross is CSUMB. Their development area is estimated because the EIR is not final on their master plan. Okay, so just drilling down a little further, looking jurisdiction by jurisdiction. City of Monterey, comparing their HMP requirements with their HCP requirements. So in terms of listed species, they're the same of what could potentially be on their property. Yadin's piperia, California tiger salamander, California red-legged frog, Monterey spine flower, and seaside bird speak. So in terms of potential outcomes, so for development, City of Monterey has 110 acres they could develop on their property. They'd need take permits under the HMP to develop all those 110 acres. They'd also need mitigation lands for those permits. So in terms of that would be the situation under the HMP. Under the HCP, should that be approved, the development of the 110 acres is included as a covered activity and it'd be permitted. In terms of what's required for borderlands, the city would have borderland requirements under the HMP because it is next to the National Monument. However, the city has no habitat reserves. And then under the HCP, it'd be the same borderland requirement. In terms of funding, there's no funding requirements for the HMP for the City of Monterey, except for their borderland management costs. And then under the HCP, development within the City of Monterey would pay the CFD or its replacement funding mechanism to fund the HCP. So in terms of Delray Oaks, it's about the same number listed species that could potentially be present. However, Delray Oaks has more additional lands of 344 acres. The same would be in place without the HCP. Under the HMP, Delray Oaks would need a permit to develop all those 344 acres. With the HCP, that development is permitted. In terms of reserves, as mentioned before, the Monterey Peninsula Regional Park District has an 18-acre reserve, so there would not be any reserve requirements on Delray Oaks, just the borderlands conditions to meet those requirements. Similarly, with the HCP, there will be borderland requirements for Delray Oaks. And then in terms of funding, there's no funding requirements under the HMP except for borderlands for Delray Oaks. And then Delray Oaks would pay, the developer would pay the CFD or its replacement funding mechanism to fund the HCP. Okay, sorry, this does get a little repetitive. We'll have some maps to break it up in a moment here. But in terms of Seaside, there's even more development lands available in Seaside, 1,811 acres. And take permits would be required to develop all of those acres. Under the HCP, that's a covered activity. So once development pays the CFD, that development could occur under the HCP. And just in terms of habitat lands in Seaside, you have 17 acres of habitat reserves. That's a reserve owned by Monterey Peninsula College. And Seaside would have borderland requirements in terms of management, but no reserves to manage. And similarly, under the HCP, those borderland conditions are the same. Moving on to City of Marina. So looking here at City of Marina, you do have a jurisdiction with habitat reserves. That's the big distinction here. Since Marina has a lot of entitled development, you have fewer acreages, fewer number of acres that could be developed. 994 is a rough estimate, looking at what's available at the airport, areas outside of the dunes and Sea Haven. So mitigation lands would be needed to develop all of those 994 acres. And this development would be included under the HCP, not under the HMP. Marina has no borderland requirements under the HMP since it's not next to the Fort Ord National Monument, but it does have habitat reserves totaling 154 acres. And in terms of the HCP, the borderlands requirements would be required next to any habitat reserves in City Marina. And the reserves are the same total. Now, in terms of funding, the City Marina would need to fund, in either scenario, management of the habitat reserves, the 154 acres. And in terms of getting permits for the 994, typically speaking, if there's, say there's 30 acres that are impacted of a plant species, you usually have to mitigate to get a permit 2 to 1 or 3 to 1. So you'd need 60 or 90 acres of reserve to get a permit, just roughly speaking. So Marina would have to look outside its jurisdiction to develop all of those 994 acres. Okay, so looking at just a little more detail, just want to mention these species don't always have respect for borders or fences or parking lots. You find them along the base where you least expect them at times. So in terms of the City of Marina, they had more of the Army's urbanized footprint than other jurisdictions, but they still have endangered species found within some of their existing developments and proposed developments in the future. So I just wanted to look at some more detail here. At the dunes on Monterey Bay, with the HCP, there is an area in their Phase 3 that has a listed plant species. So with the HCP, that take would be permitted. Without, they'd have to coordinate with the wildlife agencies for any impacts, likely would require a permit. Cypress Knolls is also another entitled development. It has endangered plant species identified within its confines of the development, and they would be in a similar situation. With the HCP, that take would be permitted. Without, they'd need to seek a permit. With the Sea Haven, they went and obtained a 2081 permit from the state so they could develop their initial phases. So they are working independently with the state as they proceed with their development. In terms of a couple of infrastructure projects, just looking at the Marina Airport plan, the HCP accommodates the expansion of the runway for the airport. So the City Marina, to expand the runway, they would not need to get a separate permit under the HCP. But if there's no HCP, they would have to work out a methodology with the resource agencies, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the state, to get a permit and expand that runway. In terms of another infrastructure project, Del Monte Extension, and that also would likely need a permit if any species are found in that roadway alignment. And I just want to show you on a map here, there's the airport, and the habitat reserve is affected, the Marina Airport HMA, by that orange area that would expand the runway. And then in terms of the Del Monte extension, that's the yellow line that goes through the habitat reserve. Most likely it would have some impact on species. Okay, so looking at just a few more of these detailed items, looking at the county now. County of Monterey, our estimate here, so about the same species would be affected. I think we've added one species to the list here with Smith's blue butterfly. There's some potential habitat of that species in the County of Monterey. But in terms of development, the county, we just estimate, has about 1,595 acres of development. Without the HCP, under the HMP, take permits would be required, and mitigation lands would be, some of the county's mitigation lands could satisfy that, but the county has 1,507 acres. As I mentioned, sometimes it's a 2 to 1 or 3 to 1 ratio, so even the county might run out of space needed to develop that fully. And then in terms of requirements, there's borderland requirements in the county. There's slightly more under the HCP because additional habitat reserves are held within the county. And then funding-wise, the county would need to fund management of those 1,507 acres with the HMP or under the HCP. That's not funded, wouldn't fall to the burden of the county necessarily. It would be the Forest CFD or the replacement funding mechanism. Okay, looking at UC. So UC has a similar list of species that could potentially be found on its property. They have approximately 479 acres of development and 598 acres of reserve. So they do have some areas where they could use to, with no HCP, satisfy some permitting requirements. In terms of funding-wise, they do have borderland requirements under the HCP, but no borderland requirements under the HMP since they're not next to the Fort Ord National Monument. Again, development would pay for habitat reserve management under the HCP through collection of CFD fees. So that's a specific agreement FOR has with UC, which is kind of unique because we don't have a similar agreement with CSUMB or MPC. They've agreed to pay the FOR CFD and participate in the HCP. Okay, looking at CSUMB, they don't have any habitat reserves, but they have approximately 532 acres. This is a rough estimate of allowed development, and take permits would be required in the HMP. That would be covered as a covered activity and permitted under the HCP. There are no borderland requirements. Oh, there are just a very small amount of borderland requirements under the HMP, with more borderland requirements under the HCP for the CSUMB. And in terms of funding, CSUMB has agreed to pay for the cost of preparing the HCP and also its borderland management costs. So they are contributing through a negotiated agreement due to our CEQA lawsuit with FOR and Marina's CEQA lawsuit with CSUMB several years ago. Okay, looking at MPC, they're another one that has reserves and development. So they have approximately 296 acres of development and 206 acres of reserves. And under the HMP, there would not be any allowed take without permits, so they'd have to obtain their own permits. Under the HCP, the development of MPC's lands would be permitted, and then they have a negotiated in lieu payment to FORA as part of joining the HCP. So it's this agreement made in 2002. They agreed to pay $500,000 to FORA for infrastructure, and that included habitat requirements. Okay, looking at state parks, we're getting towards the end here. So state parks, they have slightly different list of listed species. They include western snowy plover and Smith's blue butterfly because they like to reside around the coast, and that's their special habitat areas. And then they have about 145 acres of development within the state park and 834 acres of habitat reserves. They receive funding now through annual state appropriations, and they're implementing their HMP requirements under the HCP. They've agreed to continue to seek state funding, so the funding for the management of that reserve would be primarily state funded. The cooperative has agreed to, the HCP agreements would be some of the additional monitoring required under the HCP would be covered by the JPA. Okay, looking at some regional projects, I just wanted to point out here, the HCP incorporates allowed take. It doesn't approve these projects, but should they occur, that infrastructure of the take permits would be there to implement the FORTAG. So the FORTAG would probably affect this potential list of species. We have Smith's blue butterfly, California tiger salamander, California red-legged frog, Monterey spine flower, seaside bird's beak, and Sanguilia. It would affect nearly every jurisdiction on the base since it's a trail that's over 20 miles long. And then also just looking at how much would be affected, we're looking at about 19 acres in the habitat reserves would be affected, and 140 acres in development areas would be affected by the trail. We have a measure in the HCP that they'll mitigate at a 1-to-1 ratio for that take, but it would be permitted under the HCP. Without the HCP, there'd have to be a new negotiation to work out with the wildlife agencies. And the wildlife agencies, it's a little more challenging with these regional projects, how to get a permit when you're affecting multiple jurisdictions and crossing so many different borders. So they really have mentioned to us individual take permits are going to be challenging, if not impossible, if there's not an HCP. So this is just a map looking at the foretag. So the blue areas are the main trunk line of the foretag. You have it stretching from the 8th Street Bridge, coming across the landfill, up around some UC property to the airport, and then there's also another blue trunk line that goes through Seaside down through the county, along Seaside with how it interfaces with the National Monument down to Delray Oaks. So that's quite a multi-jurisdictional project that's been proposed, and right now the HCP would accommodate that. Okay, looking at other proposed development that would be allowed for take, Marina Coast Water District has a number of infrastructure projects, approximately 36 acres in HMAs, and it's also a multi-jurisdictional approach. So without the HCP, you'd have quite a difficult road to hoe to get permits to do these infrastructure projects. And this is just a map to show where they are. A number of areas are in the county. You have some well sites which look like the shooting targets. You have some reservoirs that are the kind of blue with the waves, and then you have some tank sites that are out near the BLM office, for example. You also have some pipes, so it's hard to see probably, but some of the brown looking lines are pipelines that would go in through HMAs. And this is just looking at the habitat reserve system. So under the HCP, these are all the various habitat reserves, and under the HMP as well. So you see on the coast, going from left to right, the blue area is the Fort Ord Dune State Park. Then you have the Marina Northwest Corner. You have 3 reserves in Marina: the Northwest Corner, the Airport Reserve, the Salinas River Habitat Area, and then UC is in Marina as well, but it's owned by UC, the UC Foner Reserve, which connects to the county reserves, and MPC also abuts the monument. And then there's a few county reserves over by Laguna Seca, Lookout Ridge, and Wolf Hill. So we're talking about 18,000 acres, about 2/3 of the base being preserved. I just want to show you where some of these species reside. As I mentioned, they don't really respect fences or jurisdictional boundaries. The seeds go with the wind. The animals have different ranges. So you're looking here at one of the state-listed species. This is Sanguilia. It requires a state permit to develop in any of these areas. And then also just to do management activities in the reserves, you need a permit. So looking at, you find this species in almost all the jurisdictions. It's pretty pervasive on the base. And then this is Seaside's Birdspeak, slightly less, a smaller extent on Fort Ord, but definitely in City of Monterey, Delray Oaks, and Seaside, and a few county areas. All right, now we're talking about California tiger salamander. This is both a state and federal listed species, and they have 2 types of habitat. They have the aquatic habitat, which you see with the red and blue kind of dots on the screen. Those are the ponds where the CTS has its breeding habitat. Then you have upland habitat, and that's all the yellow you see on the map. So it's definitely primarily within the reserves, but also in some development areas. So to develop, it would require permits. Okay, I'm going to transition over to the transition plan. So looking at what the Transition Task Force has discussed on the HCP, there's been a desire by the task force to tie up any loose ends. So the HCP is definitely one of those loose ends to tie up. So to have more things settled rather than unsettled with the transition plan. And part of that was looking at who's the recipient organization for FOR's HCP or HMP responsibilities. So FOR's collected to date about $14 million towards an HCP endowment. The question would be, who's going to receive that in the transition plan? We have a JPA that's proposed as part of the HCP process. We're looking to have everything wrapped up by April 2019. Question would be in the transition plan, do you want a JPA set up sooner in the next few months to have one that just implements the HMP and could be amended in the future to serve for purposes of the HCP? Or do you want to just designate the one that will be created next spring? Another idea or another preference the County Fort Ord Subcommittee did mention as a recommendation to have a trigger date by which, if there's no HCP, you set up a JPA. Okay, looking at JPA formation. So as the Transition Task Force suggested, we have an option to form the JPA now as an entity to implement the HMP, and it could be the recipient of those 4 CFD revenues. We expect by 2020 that $14 million will grow to $21 million, so it'd be some significant dollars to transfer. And then in terms of if the HCP is approved, that JPA, that should we set it up now, could be amended to implement the HCP. In terms of the EIS process, we just want to note we have the streamlined EIS process moving ahead. So it could be an extra step if we create the JPA now, but it could help us rest better at night if we want to have everything wrapped up. So looking at the board's discussion or recommendations for the board today, one is to receive the status report. Another is to consider directing staff to work with jurisdictions on the feasibility of forming a joint powers authority to implement the base-wide habitat management activities required by the 1997 HMP. And we're available for your questions.
Thank you, Jonathan. I have one question to begin with, and according to my recollection, which is in 2020 these days, I believe the board has directed staff through a couple of actions to move forward with the JPA. Is that recollection correct, or am I dreaming again?
The board last directed staff to proceed with the HCP, which would form the JPA as needed. That would be next spring for the HCP.
Okay, just wanted to make sure that there was an action that I wasn't imagining. Okay, questions? Yes, Ms. Amadeo.
One of the things that struck me when our executive officer, Michael Humard, was speaking was that we have raised approximately $23 million so far for habitat management. The total cost was $60 million, so there's approximately a $40 million difference. Now, I understand the funding comes through the CFD, but I don't understand the funding. There was no timeline up there to describe how that future funding, whether it be a continuation for a CFD or some new CFD mechanism implemented by each one of the jurisdictions, but how much would be needed to meet that eventual $60 million budget.
Right. We could add that. My estimate of June 30, 2020 of something about a third of the total that we needed is kind of what I was talking about. We post June 30, 2020, we'd have to raise that $40 million someplace. We assumed it would all come out of the Community Facilities District. So if the Community Facilities District remains in place under some scenario, it would continue to generate those revenues. If not, under our transition planning, we're assuming there's a substitute of some sort. In the city of Marina, you've already worked with at least one developer and have a written confirmation they would absorb that obligation at least to what it is in June 30, 2020. So every jurisdiction would have to do that in order to continue to generate the revenues. Now, if that happened, it essentially winds up being a pay-as-you-go program because you don't have the need to generate the revenues if you're not doing developments. But as you do developments, they pay the fee. It's the developments that create the take. So right now, we have a provision which is called the stay ahead provision, and that's what I'm talking about. We are ahead right now. As long as we continue to collect fees, we're staying ahead of the take provisions. So the permittees, the regulatory agencies have said as long as the permittees are collecting enough revenue to stay ahead of that curve, you're good. So our estimates, though, I believe, Jonathan, I'm not sure, but somewhere around 2028 or 2029, if development were to continue roughly at its rate right now, we'd be getting right around 60. Or if we change the policy, and instead of 30 cents on the dollar of everything we collected more, you would get there quicker. But anytime you do that, you're changing your priorities. So it just depends on if there's a CFD in place or a replacement, and what's the priority for those dollars.
So I need to follow up on that. That funding mechanism eventually goes away because development is completed.
Yes.
And so my understanding, though, is that the management does not go away.
No.
That's in perpetuity. So once that funding mechanism is gone, I'm assuming that that $60 million that has been collected over time is to fund the program through whatever investment or whatever investment program is set up by the JPA in perpetuity. Or is there going to be a necessary secondary funding someday for the operational cost of the JPA?
I was going to give you a two-word answer and say correct assumption, but I'm not going to do that because I have to refine that a little. The regulatory agencies are not going to issue their ITPs, incidental take permits, unless they're assured that the revenue is going to be in place to sustain this in perpetuity. So assuming the HCP is adopted and assuming the 2085 permit is adopted and approved by FWS and Fish and Wildlife, then you have their assurance that you're permitted. That means they have looked at this and they are assuming that the return on the investment is sufficient to kick out enough dollars every year to pay for the fence maintenance, the restoration, whatever is required in the management program annually.
So may I make a comment?
Yeah.
It seems to me that making this kind of decision today is actually premature because we don't know what funding mechanisms may be in place when we sunset. And I would suspect that that would be important in giving direction going forward, that we should have a clear understanding. Is it going to be a continuation of the same, or is it going to be each jurisdiction doing their own CFD? Is there going to be some other kind of funding mechanism when FORA sunsets? And to understand what that is in order to give some kind of direction today, this seems premature. So yeah, I don't know if that's a question or a comment, but I would like some feedback on that.
Yeah, let me say one thing, or a couple of things, is that while we're not, having an action today, some direction is desired. And while the board has grappled with this on several occasions, we've come up with the idea that there will be a JPA, but we just don't know when to implement.
And I understand that because the habitat management plan requires a JPA.
Right.
So I know that one has to exist, but how it exists, that direction, how it's going to be funded would be important to know whether or not we're going to decide on the HCP or just the required HMP.
Yes, I agree. What I was trying to say is that we do need to do the base work, the leg work, and start pulling this together so that if it's necessary, we won't have to start at that point to pull everything together. So it behooves us to direct staff to take some positive steps forward, I think. That's my opinion.
Thank you.
Mr. Oh, yeah. Chair.
Jonathan, excellent briefing as usual. A couple of things. Would it be fair to say that when we submitted our initial HCP to the California government, Department of Fish and Wildlife, and the other agencies up there over 20 years ago, that they would have approved our plan, which was pretty extensive back then, like 99% complete, and not delayed for over 20 years? The funding that we had available 20 years ago was sufficient to meet our obligations forever under the then HCP, but because they delayed 20 years, we now have a deficit between $20 and $40 million.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. The cost has gone up as we've gone longer through this process because the requirements have been more strenuous, more monitoring, more detail about how to manage the species.
Exactly. So for them not doing their job, we're the ones suffering for it, not them. The other question is, you mentioned under the HCP that one of our management responsibilities was the California tiger salamander, and that there were issues of the California tiger salamander having amorous relations with the native salamander. I know this is California, but is part of our HCP managing the dating habits between these two animals?
Yeah, they're from Arizona. That's all I have to say.
Moving back to normalcy.
Whatever that is.
Yeah, whatever that is. One of the things being requested today is that we give direction to staff to work with the jurisdiction on the formation of the JPA. Are we talking about all of the jurisdictions, or are we just talking about the land use jurisdictions when you talk about working with them?
In the past, we've assumed it's the permittees, it's the folks that are impacted by the HCP. So it's not just the underlying land use jurisdictions, it's CSU, UC, state parks, etc.
So is
Jonathan actually has a list, I believe.
So are we anticipating that the non-land use jurisdictions would be contributing in some way to the obligations?
Yes, in some cases we already have agreements. Now, if you consider UC and CSU land use jurisdictions, and Monterey Peninsula College a land use jurisdiction, we have agreements with the three of them for contributing.
And is there any, to your knowledge, is there any requirement or binding of these various jurisdictions to actually join the joint powers agreement?
I don't believe there's a binding agreement.
So
If you join, you get the benefits of the ITP. If you don't, you're on your own.
So if Seaside were to say no, or Marina were to say no, then the funds that would otherwise be received would be controlled by the individual jurisdiction to satisfy the requirements?
Jonathan?
Right. So FORA designates our CFD dollars collected, say 2020, to this new JPA, that there's no HCP for some reason. That JPA has the money, so if you're not a member, you're not saying where those dollars go.
Is it possible, or is anyone considering just forming a joint powers authority for the purpose of just handling the funds? And have the jurisdictions work with the JPA just to say, well, you've got $21 million and we've got funds that we can contribute but have to be used in a certain way.
I don't remember that approach, but I don't know why it can't be, but I don't know that approach.
Thank you.
Hadn't been suggested so far.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
That's something else we can look at. Ed and then Dennis.
So to follow on with Frank's comments, interesting point, but I guess then it questions wouldn't a city or jurisdiction want to very carefully look at the benefits of having the JPA, because then it's the efficiencies of the cost mitigation. But it sounds like the mitigation moving forward for quite a number of years is going to be exceptionally costly for each jurisdiction, especially if a jurisdiction chose to go it alone. So I think the other equation of this is the benefits slide up there, I think is worthy. If you could go back to that, there was a page there that was the benefits of having the HMP and the HCP, and it was outlined, I think, fairly accurately. So for me, I think it's a little bit of a need to know more of the benefits if a city went it alone or went with a JPA.
John, first of all, thank you. My question is similar to Jerry's, but it's serious. Not that he wasn't. If a species is introduced to the area legally or otherwise and finds itself natural to that area, is it the surrounding jurisdiction's responsibility then, even if it moves beyond where it was introduced, to take care of it and therefore possibly decrease developmental area?
I'll let Jonathan think about that for a minute, but in our work to date, we have found that a number of non-native invasive species have made their way on the former Fort Ord. And Bill Collins, I see him shaking his head up and down. It's a consistent issue and problem. Everything from hemlock to ice plant to other kinds of things that over-compete with the listed species create problems, make it difficult to manage for that habitat. And so we do wind up sometimes getting into the behavioral patterns of plants, flora or fauna, depending on and how to manage to protect that species. Because there's a certain network within these coastal prairie communities of habitat for the listed species. So there's a concern there. So your question is well made, because actions taken by others in the past have made the habitat at risk for certain species. We've had to manage for that. We've restored many acres across the basin, very significant cost in ways under the ESCA, and in very both active and passive ways, and have to abate those species that get in the way. We thought that there were great concerns when the state agency thought we needed to manage California tiger salamander, their behavioral patterns that Jerry mentioned earlier, to try to conserve. And so that's no longer as much of an issue as it was just a few months ago. But yes, there's real questions about how you manage those, Dennis.
I would just add on that, as we mentioned earlier about the HMP, if the HCP is a marathon, HMP is like a half marathon. So here we have the list of HMA acres. So this, for example, is just pull out Seaside, for example. We'll pick any Seaside. 17 acres of reserves. Well, that's not a city-managed reserve, but it's MPC managed. And the salamander, for example, has the invasive salamander present, since it's usually in its hybrid form. But to manage that, since you have the HMP, it's already required to manage those reserves on that column. And that includes for salamander. The question, so, and for the Army to do its action of transferring the land and doing the cleanup, obligations have already been assumed by the jurisdictions. The question is, do you want to spend a little more time and money and effort to get an HCP to allow improved development of the reserves, more coordination with the reserves, allow for activities to occur in the reserves and in development property, or without that it's an individual by individual approach, but you still have this core of the reserve system to manage either way.
Okay, any other questions? I would point out that one of the dangers or negatives of not engaging in a JPA and going it alone is that you may not have enough area to be able to mitigate your own development. You won't be able to tap into the pool to enable your to make up the difference in your mitigations. I know that's the case in Seaside, and I believe in Morena as well. And that becomes an obstacle to development. And I'd hate to see us curtail our activities. The other thing that occurred to me was, as we move forward in this, we still have to work together, and not necessarily regionally in terms of the whole county, but at least within our footprint on the former Fort Ord and see how we can cooperatively manage this. And with the amount of time and effort that's put into the HCP, I wonder what the stranded cost would be if Ford just decided not to do it. Well, how much effort and time and money have we spent towards this? And if we turned our back on it, how much stranded cost we're talking about? Yes, sir.
Yeah, just following up on your comment, is 3 questions. One, if you don't know the answers, I'll get with you later on during the week or whatever. Is there a somewhat of a ratio between the HMA area to the development area that we're looking at, so that the land use jurisdiction is roughly in a ballpark of what they have available? Do we know that, or does it vary by jurisdiction?
It varies by jurisdiction because there are different species present in each jurisdiction, and in terms of, for example, what Marina might need to develop its 994 acres might be less than what Delray Oaks needs just to develop 344 acres.
Okay, second question is, can an HMA area be invoked or set aside outside of the old Fort Ord on other properties to make the mitigation?
I think that there is potential for that. We have allowable mitigation banks in California, for example. I'd say the wildlife agencies are more hesitant to have habitat that's not connected, not a regional approach. So in terms of what's best for the species, that's kind of the hat the regulatory agencies put on. And they think, okay, well, are the reserves connected? Is it integrated? Or is it just a reserve here, then a bunch of development, and a reserve here, no connection between the reserves? They're more likely to go with the integrated approach, make it easier on you, make the process more streamlined. If it's permit by permit, there's more risk with the species, so it's a more difficult process.
And the last question is, Seaside may not have enough mitigation area, Delray Oaks may have some excess. Would it be possible to go across jurisdictional boundary where Delray Oaks could set aside mitigation areas for Seaside?
We've had a circumstance where that already is occurring on Fort Ord. You could do that in the future as well. This, for example, the Marina Heights project in Marina, Sea Haven, is mitigating its impacts on county land and the landfill site, as one example.
As one of the jurisdictions that's not included, I'm just making an observation on the report and the choices that we have, and it seems clear as just an observer that a joint power would be an appropriate way to go for the mitigation that we're just talking about for the IT and all of the programs that would already be available to the various jurisdictions that they would have to go it alone should there not be one. So what I'm wondering now is which of the forms would be the best direction to give to staff, A or B?
And that is the question. I'm a little disappointed that some of the other players in this aren't here today, and that when it comes up at the board, they're going to say, well, you know, we don't have enough time. We haven't discussed this. We haven't looked at this. And I think that if we make a direction point right now, that will probably be over-discussed again. So I think probably we're better off to, I hate to do this, but, you know, punt to the full board meeting where we have full participation. We may just, you know, the time we spent here was good for us, but it would have been better if all the players were here so that we wouldn't have to do a repeat at a board meeting. And because if we go ahead and do it here, then they're going to take the postures that we're ramming it down their throat. And, you know, we don't want to get into that whole scenario. Yes, sir.
Just very briefly, Ms. Ram has mentioned A and B as options, but there is also option C, just abandon the HCP process and assign the 4 funds collected so far to 4 jurisdictions. So we're looking at, and I'm not saying A, B, or C, I'm just saying that there are 3 different options presently looked at, to be looked at. Thank you.
Yeah, and I appreciate everybody being here that is here because it really is important. Mr. Alexander.
Thank you. Michael, I want to get back to something you mentioned earlier on. I asked this, and I just thought about it, is because I think there's a large segment of the public that don't differentiate between open space and habitat. And in fact, I wasn't clearly sure on what they were until better today. So as an example, what could be done on open space that could not be done on habitat, or what are the overlaps?
I think I did that, but I'll let it go. When I said open space and habitat, there probably a couple thousand acres of open space that aren't really habitat, although in many ways they are affected by what we do with our program. An example, most folks would call the trail system open space. It's not really habitat. It may go through habitat, but the trail system is considered development. In order for the trails on Fort Ord to be able to be implemented, TAMC, when they put together a program for the trails, will have to do an environmental impact report and show how they are mitigating for the impact of those acres and acres of land that's being taken away from conservation of species, of listed species. So that's a development area, but it's still open space. A park, for example, the city of Marina is going to have a fairly significant park in the Sea Haven project area. That'll be a park that'll be actively used, but it's open space, and I think most folks consider it that way. We have other areas that along the coast, I'm not sure that they're going to be precisely open space, but in our open space areas we have development. We have visitor serving uses like restrooms and trailheads, and we're going to have RV parks at the state park. So those are all considered by many to be open space, but they really are development. But in terms of open space, we probably have up to 75, 77% of the base is open space or habitat. Of that, probably 80% of that is conserved for habitat. I think the number is 17,000 and change, Jonathan, is specifically listed for endangered species.
Since this is a more casual event, I can ask a question to help me learn, because I serve on the TAMC board, and FORTAG was a great example as a development versus the habitat crosses, uses, shared space, because we can't control the habitat goes. But is the proper term for that development causing us to get what's called a take permit? And if you could address a little bit of that, about the process in the context of a jurisdiction that's a JPA that's managing the habitat going forward, how do we process those various take permits for those developments that are cross-jurisdictional? And I think FORTAG is a great example.
Well, using FORTAG and a network of trails that crosses the Marina Airport, the University of California, California State University, federal lands, state lands at the coast, and individual jurisdictional lands, some set aside for development. I think even the landfill site is an area that's where there's going to, City of Delray Oaks, City of Monterey, the connecting all of the base with the National Monument is wonderful. It's an asset. It's something you have to have, which is access if it's going to be an asset. It is considered by the regulatory agencies, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and California Fish and Wildlife, as development. And so it's, as Jonathan said, when you're crossing, and I think in looking at this map, it probably crosses jurisdictional boundaries maybe over a dozen times. You're talking about doing an incidental take permit with multiple different jurisdictional issues and requiring that you have the take of X amount of acres mitigated by the conservation of X amount of acres. If it's individual for that one project and not part of the HCP, you're asking for something akin to 90 acres. Is that the number, Jonathan? For the 30 acres of take. Did I get?
Yeah, we calculated about 140 acres in development areas on the base, plus an additional 19 within HMAs for this main blue trunk line of the FORTAG. That's a rough.
So something like 400 acres for the 180 acres, that in order to, if it's 2 to 1, you might be able to find 400 acres someplace that would mitigate for that. Now that would be 400 acres that would be set aside for development, not habitat management areas. That would be development areas you'd have to take back. If you don't have an HCP with an incidental take permit, that clears that for use. Are those the numbers correct, Jonathan?
Yes, I would just add in there that to get a permit, the process is the state has a process, the federal government has their own process. Depends on which species you affect, but you would, TAMC, for example, could be lead agency, probably is lead agency on the FORTAG. So part of that, they look at special status species, including endangered and threatened species under the state and federal acts, and they would see what's present, do surveys, and then they would know how much acres is occupied by those species, and then they would put that in their permits, and then sit down and negotiate with the wildlife agencies how much land has to be reserved, where are you going to reserve this land for the permit, and how much funding are you going to put in place so that we know this management of this habitat is going to be protected for perpetuity, since the impacts are forever, the protections have to be forever. That's kind of their language. And then they would have to sign on the permits. Both the developer or lead agency, could be TAMC in this instance, plus the wildlife agencies.
I would say that if you were very efficient and you could identify the areas where you would do the mitigation, and you don't have an HCP, but you've already got all the biological work that we've done thanks to Erin Harwain and her folks, you might be able to get this done in 3 years, something like that. Erin, is that probably what it would take? Because you'd have to do federal first. You couldn't do them concurrently. You'd have to do them sequentially. So you're probably 3 years plus, but Erin can give you some really good numbers in.
So I think FORTAG is a great example because it also encompasses all the jurisdictions like the HCP does. However, it's a little bit different. For FORTAG, it's going to be a phased programmatic approach, and so you might not know all your take. You might even want to do incidental take permits by segment of your trail. There are a lot of different things that could happen. I think the key point is that the holistic approach of the base-wide HCP, allows you to more expeditiously look for a permitting strategy. If you're going at it alone and you're trying to do the whole thing, and you need to go back, they might require you to go back and do baseline surveys, even though we've been updating the surveys base-wide since '92. We haven't done one for the trail itself, specifically that alignment. So you might have to get your own data, which could be years of data collection. So 3 to 5 years maybe for the whole trail, if you're doing it as a whole.
Ms. Avondale.
Thank you, Chair Rubio. When I look at this and I see the habitat management area, which is huge, and then I heard under the habitat management plan, jurisdictions have to use their habitat area. You cannot use the BLM land. So I understand the problem there. But under the HCP, does the local jurisdictions then have the opportunity to use BLM land? Because I was confused about that statement in the original.
Right, and Eric Morgan's here, so he'll correct me if I'm wrong, but the way we have been instructed by the regulatory agencies is to the extent that the work that we are doing to assist and do more than the BLM would do under its normal circumstances for management, you get that credit towards your work. And we need that if we're going to do California tiger salamander. I have a whole problem with that because the assumption in that very comment says that BLM's not going to do the work the most are going to do. When you think about it, BLM has always done great work. They've got great wildlife biologists, they have a great manager. BLM always does great work. But we're talking about restoration, enhancement, and other things that what we've set aside in HCP on the Fort Ord National Monument would do is that we would get credit for that. And so that helps us with California tiger salamander in particular. which is maybe the one we're mostly focused on for baseline work.
One thing that occurs to me while we're discussing FORTAG and some of the issues, if a jurisdiction were to go it alone and had, a constrained amount of mitigatable area, then you might be faced with a choice of whether to use that mitigation for FORTAG or for affordable housing. And so, I mean, that becomes a dilemma of sorts. I mean, I would automatically go for the affordable housing, but, some people in the community wouldn't agree with that. But, yes, ma'am.
I just wanted to point out that I'm fully aware that there were A, B, and C, but given the, for clarification, but just to give as an observer, and that's who I am today because I don't have, our jurisdiction isn't involved in the outcome. The presentation led me to believe that one or other, A or B, directing the staff is the best way to go for the jurisdictions that are involved. I think they have far more to gain as a group than they do as an individual, and we certainly need to move on with the original plans that were set forth for the base reuse initially in 1997, and this is the continuation, as they stated, of the marathon. And I just would put that forward that as an observer, it seems to me a clear option, one or two of the continuation of going forward with the HCP and of JPA to see that it gets carried out by the group and as a community effort, because this is a community and this has to be a community effort, and some cooperation is extremely important.
Chair, if I may, I certainly didn't mean to insult you, just that for people who do not have this document in front of them, there is a C. And the concern that I have, very briefly, is that the agenda calls for us to consider directing staff to work with the jurisdictions on the formation of the JPA. A, B, and C, especially A and B, our executive officer suggesting the formation of a JPA cooperative. That is not what is in front of us today under the terms of the agenda. So actually A, B, and C are nice thoughts, but we're just asking today to unbinding situation to tell staff to talk to the various jurisdictions such as Seaside Marine, and if Marine and Seaside say we don't want anything to do with anything about this, then that's their prerogative. But am I correct in understanding it's just directions?
Yes, a workshop.
Great. Thank you.
I don't think it even says action. It says,
no. Just consider.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think that we just receive what we've received and move it on to the next step. I'm sure there's some folks here that feel that JPA is appropriate. Maybe others aren't quite ready to take that step. But I think we'll move this on to the full board for further consideration. Is that okay with everybody? I'm not making any motions. I'd like to open it up to the public. Is there any public comment? You got one.
Magic fingers. I appreciate this discussion. It has been very helpful, and we appreciate the direction to work with the individual agencies really to understand the creation of the HCP versus the HMP. It would certainly help me as the manager of Marina to understand all the options. We certainly want to do that. As I was listening to the discussion, one of the things that that I was weighing in my mind was, so we talked about the HCP and the funding for the CFD. The CFD funding is there only if the growth continues to occur, and if the growth doesn't continue to occur, does the HMP really become a better option? Because you're looking at, we still have all the lands out there, we still got the impacts to mitigate. We've had how many thousands of acres that for the past 25 years have sat there and nothing has happened. And those are things that we want to talk through and weigh through and understand really what are the best options to address all these things. So thank you.
Thank you. Any other public comment? Okay, bring it back.
So, yeah, I think I would go back to the, Lane, thank you. You've been very thoughtful on all these habitat issues here and elsewhere, but our stay-ahead provision under the HCP essentially gives you that same protection, but whether or not development goes forward determines whether or not you have a need. So if you have a development that required HMP mitigation, that's where you'd run into the issue. How do you then develop that? You might have more cost going alone. So what we've been trying to analyze is how do we put all those pieces together, and it sounds like the board wants to fully understand the differences between the different approaches. If you go alone, I heard we need to have more information on what that means, versus if you go collectively. To date, most of the time we've assumed, based on the numbers we've looked at, it's more efficient and more effective to go holistically, but we'll take another look at that.
Okay, are there any other comments, or Aaron, yes? Yeah, sure.
Thanks. I just want to clarify a couple things regarding Mayor Edelin's comments on the ratios. Typically, the wildlife agencies require 3 to 1. So for every acre of impact, you need usually 2 or 3, but they're going with 3 a lot of the times that I'm seeing. So maybe triple amount of the area. And then your question was great about Seaside and Delray Oaks potentially working together, and that's a great potential resource. And I think what Jonathan opened up was a really important comment, that most of these species are only found on Fort Ord, and this is their major area. So looking outside of Fort Ord, with maybe the exception of California tiger salamander, it'll be more and more difficult for you to find mitigation area. And I don't know if you've tried to buy coastal property, but a lot of these species are coastal, and it's really expensive. So I want to put that a couple things out there for you regarding that. And I really appreciate all the work Forest staff did in trying to compare the HMP and the HCP. When you're talking about a half marathon and a marathon, the HCP is very, very detailed. The HMP is not. One of the challenges we've had, Denise Duffy and Associates, is because we're tasked with the CEQA NEPA documentation, the EIS, EIR. So we're tasked with analyzing what the no project scenario looks like. If there's no HCP, what does everybody have to do? Which is a lot of what we're talking about today. So talking about each jurisdiction having to implement the HMP, we've got our finger on that. We can estimate and know what that will look like if we don't develop, because you're going to be required to implement the HMP whether you develop or not. Those are in your deed restrictions. The land's been transferred. Most of the jurisdictions are responsible to turning in annual reports to Eric over there every November, and there's a lot of stuff that's supposed to be done now that you have the land. And what are you supposed to do? And I think this is Lane's question. This is many of your questions. And if you don't mind, I just want to read this one. HMP measure. This is the airport. This has to do with the airport reserve. It says, for management requirements, gates or vehicle barriers will be constructed along access roads as necessary to prevent unauthorized off-road vehicle use in parcel L5.1.11. Habitat remaining in that parcel after development will be managed to maintain existing habitat values for HMP species. What the heck does that mean? What level of effort do you have to go to? So what you're going to have to do is create these resource management plans for each of your parcels. And you're going to be required to check in with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service annually. And if they're not happy, if things change, you're going to be constantly working to update that plan and implement these activities. And while, like I said, Forest staff has done an amazing job trying to tease out what these requirements look like, it's all going to be individually done parcel by parcel HMA by HMA with these jurisdictions. And if these activities result in take, which many might, you're going to need state and federal permits. You might be able to do a lot of these habitat management activities without permits, but given the vagueness of it, we can't say. We can't say exactly. We can't say when. We can't say how much it's going to cost. But it's a significant process. And so I just wanted to, I don't want anybody to have unreasonable expectations with what we bring back to you, because we don't know exactly.
Thank you.
That was an excellent argument or presentation. Would it be possible during the actual board meeting just to clear away some of the fog, at least my fog, where we look at a cross-jurisdictional HCP or HMP consideration, where Seaside and Delray Oaks, Marina and Seaside, or whatever else, let's say a hypothetical development where it would affect both jurisdictions, how it would be done, how the cost could be allocated, either individually or together if we were part of a JPA, looking at the pros and cons so we'd have a better understanding. Right now it's so theoretical that before we can implement something, I'd like to just see, sink my teeth in an example that shows how easy or how difficult it would be to either go with the JPA or go separately.
So a development scenario that doesn't exist, but
right,
that might
like a modeling of a choice.
It's a good concept. Okay, any other comments? Okay, very good. Well, thank you, staff, for the hard work. Thank you for coming, those of you that are here. And I imagine we'll have a continuing robust discussion on this item. We stand adjourned.
Okay.